September 26, 2025. New York. The United Nations General Assembly. As Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu began his address, an unspoken, collective statement unfolded. Dozens of delegations, from Riyadh to Ankara, rose in unison. Chairs scraped against polished marble floors, leaving behind over 100 empty seats, a stark, silent void. This was not merely diplomatic protest. This was an image, centuries old, brought vividly to life. For millennia, ancient texts foretold a time when one city would become a heavy stone for all peoples. Today, that stone is being lifted, and the world is feeling its undeniable weight. From the highest diplomatic chambers to the most urgent global headlines, an unprecedented convergence is forcing us to confront a prophecy once relegated to distant scrolls, now echoing in our present. Before we delve deeper, where are you watching us from today? Let us know in the comments below. From ancient writings to the streets of a world in upheaval, the signs are undeniable. In Jerusalem, October 2025, the ancient city finds itself cloaked in a pervasive, unsettling stillness. It is a quiet unlike its usual vibrant clamor, a silence punctuated only by the distant sounds of daily life that somehow seem muted by an invisible weight. This palpable atmosphere is more than a mere shift in mood, it is the manifestation of a prophecy, centuries old, now unfurling in real time. The words of Zechariah 12 verse 3 resonate with newfound gravity. On that day I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all peoples, all who lift it will be severely injured, and all the nations of the earth will gather against it. For generations, these verses were confined to theological discourse, distant and symbolic. Now, in the geopolitical crucible of the present year, they have transcended metaphor, becoming a chillingly accurate description of a global reality. Jerusalem, once again, stands at the vortex of international scrutiny, its fate intertwined with the converging interests and moral judgments of the world's powers. This dramatic shift in global perception did not emerge overnight. Its foundational moments unfolded days before the September 26 UN General Assembly walkout, beginning with a series of assertive diplomatic challenges. On September 23, the general debate of the 78th session of the United Nations General Assembly commenced in New York, a forum traditionally dedicated to addressing humanity's most pressing issues. This year, however, the proceedings took an immediate, confrontational turn. Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, the president of Brazil, was among the first world leaders to take the podium. His address, delivered with characteristic gravitas and an unwavering gaze, marked a pivotal moment in the escalating international posture against Israel. President Lula's voice, amplified across the cavernous assembly hall and broadcast globally, carried an unambiguous message. He leveled a direct accusation against Israel, asserting that its military campaign in Gaza amounted to genocide. The term, laden with profound legal and historical implications, was delivered with a calculated force designed to challenge the prevailing diplomatic discourse. He detailed the scale of civilian casualties, the widespread destruction of infrastructure, and the severe humanitarian crisis unfolding within the besieged Palestinian enclave, framing these outcomes as deliberate and systematic actions rather than incidental consequences of conflict. His speech underscored a narrative that viewed Israel's operations not merely as self-defense but as disproportionate aggression crossing the threshold into systematic extermination. The reaction within the General Assembly Hall was immediate and discernible. A hush fell over many sections of the delegates' seating area, replaced by a low murmur of reactions. Representatives from a significant bloc of developing nations, particularly those from the Global South and the Arab League, were observed nodding in agreement, their expressions reflecting solidarity with Lula's stance. Conversely, delegates from traditional Western allies of Israel maintained impassive countenances, though the tension in their posture was evident. The accusation of genocide is a profound diplomatic indictment, capable of triggering international legal proceedings and severe sanctions. Lula's willingness to use such a potent term on the world stage signaled a significant escalation in the rhetoric surrounding the conflict, pushing the boundaries of diplomatic criticism into the realm of international criminal accountability. President Lula's forceful address was, critically, not an isolated call but rather the culmination of an accumulating chorus of international condemnation, particularly from European nations typically considered more aligned with Western diplomatic frameworks. Preceding the UN General Assembly, several prominent European leaders had already articulated positions that chipped away at Israel's international standing, laying the groundwork for the more aggressive stance seen at the UN. Emmanuel Macron, the President of France, had emerged as a consistently critical voice. In a series of public statements from the Élysée Palace and during engagements at European Union summits, Macron had repeatedly emphasized the urgent need for international investigations into alleged war crimes. His demands went beyond mere expressions of concern, calling for independent, impartial inquiries into specific incidents of civilian harm and destruction in Gaza. Macron's rhetoric highlighted a growing European insistence on adherence to international humanitarian law and accountability for actions taken during military operations, signaling that even close allies expected a rigorous examination of Israel's conduct. His advocacy implicitly questioned Israel's self-assessment of its operations, pushing for external oversight and judicial scrutiny. Adding to this mounting pressure, Pedro Sánchez, the Prime Minister of Spain, had taken an even more assertive stance. Sánchez publicly categorized Israel's actions in Gaza as unacceptable, a descriptor that moved beyond diplomatic euphemism to a direct moral and political judgment. His government's position, articulated through official channels and parliamentary debates, extended to a demand for a comprehensive arms embargo against Israel. This call for an embargo, a measure typically reserved for nations deemed to be severe violators of international law or human rights, represented a significant escalation. It implied that Spain viewed Israel's conduct as egregious enough to warrant restricting its access to military hardware, thereby directly impacting its capacity for defense and offense. The prospect of a European nation initiating such a move held considerable weight, suggesting a potential unraveling of military cooperation and a further deepening of Israel's isolation within key alliances. These pronouncements, from the strategic calls for investigations by France to Spain's demand for an arms embargo, provided a crucial backdrop for President Lula's powerful address at the UN. Each statement, made days and weeks prior to the General Assembly, contributed to a progressively hostile diplomatic environment for Israel. They illustrated a broadening consensus among diverse global actors, from Latin America to influential European states, that Israel's actions in Gaza were transcending the boundaries of acceptable international conduct. This collective alignment of condemnation, expressed through increasingly severe diplomatic language and calls for concrete restrictive measures, solidified the early contours of an international front. It positioned Jerusalem not just as a contested city, but as a heavy stone that, as nations attempted to lift it, caused profound geopolitical injury and realignment, signaling the awakening of an ancient prophecy in the very fabric of modern diplomacy. The United Nations General Assembly, September 26, 2025. The air within the hallowed chamber was thick with anticipation, a palpable tension preceding the address by Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. Following days of mounting international criticism, including the forceful accusations leveled by President Lula da Silva, the stage was set for Israel's head of government to present his nation's defense. The moment was not merely a diplomatic formality, it was a high-stakes pivot point, meticulously observed by global powers and media outlets alike, following the increasingly unified narrative of condemnation that had permeated the earlier sessions. As Prime Minister Netanyahu approached the podium, his demeanor was resolute, reflecting the immense pressure borne by his government. His gaze swept across the delegates, a silent acknowledgement of the challenging diplomatic environment. He began his speech, his voice firm, immediately delving into Israel's narrative of self-defense, detailing the threats it faced, and asserting its sovereign right to protect its citizens from terrorism. He spoke of the complexities of urban warfare, the necessity of surgical strikes, and the tragic, yet unavoidable, collateral damage in a conflict initiated by an aggressor. His words were calibrated to appeal to principles of national security and the inherent right of a state to exist and defend its borders against existential threats. However, as Netanyahu articulated Israel's position, a carefully choreographed, silent protest unfolded across the assembly hall. First, the delegation from Egypt rose, their representatives moving with a deliberate, almost ceremonial slowness towards the exit. They were followed immediately by Jordan, then Saudi Arabia, and subsequently, the Turkish delegation. This was not a chaotic exodus but a coordinated, disciplined withdrawal. One by one, then in small groups, delegates from dozens of nations, primarily from the Middle East and parts of the global South, stood from their positions. Each chair scraped softly against the polished marble floor, creating a subtle symphony of dissent that punctuated Netanyahu's continuing address. The camera lingered on the widening gaps in the rows. Within minutes, over 100 chairs lay vacant, their emptiness a stark visual indictment. The absence of these nations, particularly key regional players like Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, represented more than just a diplomatic snub. It was a powerful, silent declaration of disengagement and profound disapproval, amplifying Israel's growing isolation on the international stage. These empty seats became a symbol, broadcast globally, of a widening chasm between Israel and a significant portion of the international community. Netanyahu, while visibly acknowledging the unfolding scene with a slight tightening of his jaw, continued his speech, his voice unwavering, yet speaking to an increasingly fractured audience. Among the delegations that remained, the atmosphere was equally telling. While some staunch allies of Israel maintained their presence and offered quiet support, many others exhibited expressions of deep skepticism or open disapproval. Delegates could be seen consulting notes, preparing for subsequent interventions or rebuttals. The lack of a unified front of support, even among those who chose not to walk out, underscored the pervasive nature of the condemnation. The silence from some was as impactful as the vocal protests from others, suggesting a profound lack of consensus and a further erosion of Israel's traditional diplomatic buffer. Adding to the escalating pressure, the legal dimension of the accusations against Israel gained significant traction. Weeks prior to the UN General Assembly climax, Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, had spearheaded a decisive move. Acting on his nation's long-standing commitment to international justice and in solidarity with the Palestinian cause, President Ramaphosa formally lodged a complaint against Israel at the International Court of Justice, ICJ, in The Hague. The filing explicitly accused Israel of committing genocide in Gaza, citing a vast array of evidence including reports of mass casualties, displacement, destruction of essential infrastructure, and restrictive humanitarian aid policies. This action by South Africa transformed the rhetorical accusations of genocide into a formal legal challenge, initiating a process that could lead to legally binding provisional measures against Israel and potentially, a landmark ruling on its conduct under international law. The ICJ's involvement elevated the crisis from a political debate to a matter of international jurisprudence, significantly increasing the stakes for Israel and deepening the gravity of the allegations. Meanwhile, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the president of Turkey, continued to be one of Israel's most vociferous critics. Erdogan's public statements were frequent and unreserved, often delivered with passionate condemnation in national addresses and at international forums. He repeatedly accused Israel of barbaric massacres and crimes against humanity in Gaza, portraying its actions as an affront to international peace and morality. Crucially, Erdogan went beyond mere criticism, demanding immediate international sanctions against Israel. His calls encompassed economic penalties, diplomatic isolation, and restrictions on military cooperation, urging the international community to take concrete punitive measures to force an end to Israel's military operations. Turkey's strategic position and Erdogan's influence in the Islamic world amplified these demands, adding considerable weight to the global push for punitive action. Even within Europe, a significant shift in stance was evident. Historically, nations like Ireland and Norway, while often advocating for Palestinian rights, maintained relatively balanced diplomatic ties with Israel. However, the intensity of the conflict and the humanitarian crisis had pushed them towards a more critical position. Their representatives, both in bilateral statements and within EU discussions, had joined the growing chorus advocating for stricter restrictions on Israel. These calls were broad, ranging from discussions within the European Union regarding the suspension of preferential trade agreements to proposals for diplomatic downgrades and targeted sanctions against Israeli officials deemed responsible for actions in Gaza. This move by traditional allies underscored the profound erosion of international goodwill towards Israel, indicating that even nations with historical sympathies were compelled to demand accountability and impose consequences, thus further tightening the diplomatic noose around Jerusalem. The collective weight of these actions, the symbolic walkout, the ICJ filing, the demands for sanctions, and the shift among allies, signified a convergence of global forces, transforming Jerusalem into the heavy stone of ancient prophecy, increasingly isolated and burdened by the world's judgment. The reverberations from the United Nations General Assembly and the International Court of Justice extended swiftly beyond the diplomatic chambers, translating political condemnation into tangible actions that began to reshape Israel's standing on the global stage. The heavy stone of Jerusalem, once a prophetic metaphor, was now manifesting as a series of concrete economic, academic, and diplomatic pressures, creating an unprecedented wave of isolation. In Brussels, the heart of the European Union, discussions within the European Parliament and among member state representatives grew increasingly heated regarding Israel's status. The primary point of contention centered on the potential suspension of preferential trade agreements. These accords, which afforded Israeli goods reduced tariffs and privileged access to the vast EU market, were now under severe scrutiny. Advocates for suspension argued that Israel's actions in Gaza violated human rights clauses embedded within these agreements, making continued preferential treatment untenable. Opponents warned of the broad economic repercussions for both sides and the potential for further destabilization in the region. The debates were intense, marked by late-night sessions and fractious committee meetings, creating significant uncertainty for Israeli exporters and investors who relied heavily on European markets. Major Israeli technology firms, agricultural producers, and manufacturers began to reevaluate their long-term strategies, facing the prospect of increased tariffs and competitive disadvantages. Financial analysts projected potential multi-billion-dollar losses, highlighting the direct economic vulnerability of Israel to these evolving political pressures. The very foundation of Israel's economic ties with its largest trading partner was now actively being questioned, moving from a theoretical risk to a palpable threat that sent ripples of concern through the Israeli economy. The academic landscape also felt the immediate impact of this shifting international sentiment. Across Western Europe, esteemed institutions began to sever ties with their Israeli counterparts. In the Netherlands, the University of Amsterdam announced its decision to suspend all new collaborative research projects and student exchange programs with Israeli universities, citing humanitarian concerns and the ethical implications of continuing partnerships amidst the ongoing conflict. This move, following weeks of student protests and faculty petitions, signaled a significant policy change. Similar announcements soon followed from leading universities in Belgium, including the Université Libre de Bruxelles, and from Spain, where institutions like the University of Barcelona initiated reviews of existing memoranda of understanding with Israeli academic centers, with many resulting in outright suspensions. These academic ruptures directly impacted vital research in fields ranging from medicine and technology to archaeology and social sciences. Joint grants were frozen, shared laboratories faced imminent closures, and promising young scholars on both sides found their career paths abruptly disrupted. For Israeli academics, this meant a growing isolation from global scientific discourse and collaborative opportunities, potentially hindering innovation and intellectual exchange and raising concerns about a potential brain drain. Beyond formal institutional breaks, a broader movement of cultural and scientific boycotts gained momentum. International film festivals began rejecting submissions from Israeli filmmakers, citing pressure from advocacy groups. Renowned musicians and artists publicly withdrew from scheduled performances in Israel or declined collaborations with Israeli artists. In the scientific community, several prominent journals faced calls to boycott papers from Israeli institutions, and invitations for Israeli scientists to speak at international conferences were rescinded. For example, a planned collaborative exhibit between a Tel Aviv art gallery and a major museum in Berlin was abruptly cancelled after widespread protests from activist groups that questioned the exhibit's timing and context. Similarly, a high-profile international physics symposium, originally slated to feature several Israeli researchers, saw their invitations withdrawn following a collective decision by the organizing committee to avoid controversy. These boycotts, often driven by grassroots movements and amplified by social media, created an atmosphere of increasing professional and artistic isolation, making it challenging for Israelis to participate in global cultural and intellectual life without facing immediate political scrutiny or outright rejection. The culmination of these mounting pressures was the serious proposition of direct diplomatic sanctions against specific Israeli ministers. Within various European parliaments and at the United Nations Human Rights Council, proposals began to circulate advocating for targeted measures, such as travel bans and asset freezes, against key members of the Israeli cabinet. These sanctions were not aimed at the State of Israel as a whole, but specifically at individuals deemed responsible for policies and actions in Gaza that had drawn severe international condemnation. For instance, specific ministers overseeing security operations or those who had made inflammatory statements regarding the conflict were identified as potential targets. Such measures, if enacted, would represent a profound personal and professional blow, severely restricting their ability to travel, conduct international diplomacy, and access financial resources abroad. This escalation from general criticism to targeted individual sanctions signaled that the isolation was no longer a risk, it was a palpable reality. It was a multifaceted crisis, deeply affecting Israel's economic stability, its academic and cultural engagement, and the fundamental freedom of movement and legitimacy of its leadership, solidifying Jerusalem's uncomfortable position at the very heart of a global confrontation. While diplomatic cables burned and economic ties frayed, the escalating condemnation of Israel manifested beyond the halls of power, spilling into the streets of major cities across the globe. The political isolation and academic boycotts detailed in previous reports found their raw, visceral expression in massive public demonstrations, underscoring a profound global shift in public sentiment. This groundswell of popular discontent served as a potent, visible counterpart to the governmental pressures, revealing a world increasingly unified in its stance against Israel's actions in Gaza. From Europe to South America, the final days of September and early October 2025 witnessed an unprecedented wave of coordinated protests. In Berlin, an estimated 50,000 demonstrators converged on the Brandenburg Gate, their chants demanding an immediate end to the conflict and stringent sanctions against Israel. The crowd, a diverse tapestry of citizens and activists, moved with a palpable energy. In Rome, vast throngs marched from the Colosseum to the Piazza Venezia, brandishing Palestinian flags that fluttered in unison with banners decrying genocide. Barcelona's streets echoed with slogans advocating for peace and justice, while in Paris, thousands streamed through the city center, culminating at the Place de la République, where speakers condemned international inaction. London saw similar scenes, with protesters filling Parliament Square and moving towards Downing Street, their voices blending into a powerful, multilingual chorus. Across the Atlantic, Buenos Aires bore witness to tens of thousands marching towards the Israeli embassy, displaying a fierce solidarity with Palestine. The visual spectacle was striking, a kaleidoscope of flags, homemade signs, and unified banners. The soundscape was equally impactful, a cacophony of drum beats, amplified speeches, and collective chants. Yet, cutting through the myriad languages, German, Italian, Spanish, French, English, Portuguese, a singular word resonated with chilling consistency: condemnation. It was a condemnation not just of specific policies but of a perceived moral failure, unifying diverse populations under a shared banner of indignation against the ongoing conflict. This global outpouring of sentiment was a stark counterpoint to the quiet, dignified diplomatic walkouts, providing a vibrant, undeniable testament to the depth of Israel's international ostracization. Amidst this terrestrial upheaval, attention also turned to celestial phenomena, drawing parallels to ancient biblical texts that speak of signs in the heavens. The prophet Joel, centuries ago, wrote, "I will show wonders in the heavens and on the earth, blood and fire and billows of smoke. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord." Joel 2 verses 30-31. These verses, long a subject of theological interpretation, now seem to possess a haunting contemporary relevance. Just weeks prior, in late August and early September, a phenomenon known as a blood moon had captivated observers across the globe. This total lunar eclipse, visible across vast swathes of the world, bathed the moon in a deep, ruddy hue, transforming it into an eerie, blood-red orb in the night sky. For many, particularly those watching the unfolding geopolitical events through a spiritual or prophetic lens, the timing was uncanny. It was a celestial event that, when paired with the escalating global tensions and the literal billows of smoke rising from conflict zones, appeared to align the heavens with the turmoil on earth. The ancient prophecy of Joel, once confined to interpretive study, now seemed to leap from its scriptural context into the tangible reality of a world in profound crisis. This convergence of events, the unprecedented international diplomatic isolation, the widespread economic and academic boycotts, the pervasive global street protests, and the conspicuous celestial sign, brings into sharp focus the very essence of the unfolding narrative. The title, "He Has Arrived," does not herald the physical appearance of a figure in the clouds, nor does it refer to the immediate revelation of a Messiah or an Antichrist. Instead, he embodies the awakening of prophetic time itself. It signifies that the word of ancient prophets, once seemingly dormant within sacred texts, has now risen with undeniable force, placing Jerusalem squarely at the center of a profound global judgment. Jerusalem, in October 2025, is no longer merely a city. It is, as Zechariah foretold, the heavy stone that continues to injure all who attempt to lift it. Each nation that rises against it, whether through diplomatic action, economic pressure, or the collective voice of its citizens, feels the weight of this ancient prophecy manifest as real-world consequence. The narrative concludes with a sobering realization: the prophecy is no longer a distant promise relegated to the annals of history or the realm of abstract belief. It is alive, tangible, and unfolding before the very eyes of a world now irrevocably drawn into its ancient, yet profoundly contemporary, drama. The diplomatic chasm that opened at the United Nations, the quiet but potent ruptures across academic and economic spheres, and the unified cry resonating from global streets, all these terrestrial tremors found their echoes in the heavens. Jerusalem, an ancient city steeped in history and prophecy, now stands at the vortex of a global confrontation, fulfilling a narrative long etched into sacred texts. What was once distant promise on parchment has irrevocably transposed itself onto global headlines, transforming into a present and undeniable reality. The prophecies that seemed to slumber have now stirred, making the city a heavy stone that leaves its mark on every nation that attempts to lift it. This intricate alignment of political, social, and even celestial phenomena invites a profound contemplation. Are we merely observing the chaotic dance of human history, or are these convergent events the unfolding of an ancient design? The current era, marked by unprecedented global solidarity and condemnation, suggests a tapestry woven not only by human hands but by threads of a timeless narrative, echoing through the ages and now visible on the world stage. It compels us to consider the depth of scriptural foresight and the intricate ways it may manifest in our contemporary world. In this confluence of signs and struggles, what do you believe these intensifying global reactions and celestial phenomena truly signify for the trajectory of our civilization? Share your insights and perspectives in the comments section below. If this journey through the awakening of prophecy has resonated with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Scripture's Flow for more examinations of history, prophecy, and their profound implications for our shared future.